You're with Julian on the Brown Note, and is COVID a first world problem, and are we killing ourselves with chemicals? If you've noticed this pandemic and who it's affected, overwhelmingly it has been the first world. This is a virus that is prone to prosper where there's bad sanitation, where there's bad healthcare, where there's overcrowding, but it's overwhelmingly affected the first world much, much worse than, say, Africa or Southern Asia. So why is that? And I've got my own theory here. Now, if you look at the countries with the most cases, there is a mix, but overwhelmingly the makeup is first world countries or borderline first world countries. And if you try and find African nations and a lot of places from sort of Southern Asia, they come far lower down the list. But if you want to look at per capita cases, then it becomes even starker. So a lot of the worst ones are, principalities or not even countries, but places that have a few thousand people. But even then, you get borderline first world countries, Georgia, Slovenia, and then straight away America. America has something like 116,000 cases for every million people. And then there's just a list of European countries all the way down to the top 30, all the way down into the 40s. And you're still not really seeing Southern Asian countries much. In fact, you still aren't seeing India because their number of cases is actually lower. But once you get down sort of like into the 70th worst country, 80th, and then you start getting around the 90s, you start getting places like Suriname, Namibia, and you keep going, and then you start to get the third world countries popping up more often. India's way down at 118 with 23,000, 1/5 per million, 1/5 of America. And then the big populations in Africa, Zambia, places like that with 18 million people, 141st in the world. Bangladesh, terrible sanitation, one of the most overcrowded countries on the earth, terrible healthcare, 145th. And it keeps going. Then you get places like South Korea, Kenya, another massive 55 million people, 165th in the world when it comes to cases per million. Ghana, another big one, 30 million people. And Vietnam, 100 million people, that's way down, 168. And Congo, Uganda, 50 million people, down at 176. So that's per capita cases per a million people. And the death rate is exactly the same. It is dominated by European nations and first world nations. The top 30 is dominated by virtually entirely first world countries. And again, you have to go all the way down. America is actually at number one. Sorry, not number one. Where is America? Peru is at number one with deaths per million of the population is nearly 6,000. But America is still up there with, I'm just trying to find it, something like 1,700. But when you go down to even countries like India, which has had an enormous outbreak comparable to America, their death toll per million is much, much lower. Now, a lot of these really big countries in Africa, I mean, even Indonesia's had a tiny fraction of the number of deaths per million people that America has, with a near 300 million population. But the African nations are famously have really bad sanitation and massive overcrowding in slums. Yet their outbreaks consistently put them near the bottom of the world ranking, as do places like Vietnam and Thailand and a lot of the Southern Asian countries. Even, believe it or not, China is right down at the bottom of the list of cases per million and cases, deaths per million. In fact, it is virtually at the bottom. It is right down with boats, certain cruise ship liners. The only comparison where that anomaly is even close is India, which is way out ahead of all of the other third world, broadly speaking, nations. Now, most of the population in India is about third world. America has something like 3 to 4 times the amount of death that India does from coronavirus per million people. And you might say, well, India's got 3 to 4 times the population of America. Fair enough. But even that anomaly, which is really statistically high and out of kilter with all of the other third world countries, why in a country with notoriously bad healthcare, sanitation and overcrowding in slums would they even have the same death rate as an American country with brilliant sanitation, brilliant access to healthcare, no overcrowding, no slums? Why do they have the same death rate? Now, this is what I think and why COVID has attacked Europe vastly worse than it has attacked Africa. I think the difference is industrial farming. Back in around the 1950s, the developed world started pumping chemicals into our food chain. We used them in pesticides to kill creatures that were eating our crops. We used them in growth hormones to grow animals faster. We used them in the feed. We used them in the antibiotics to treat animals. You even see stuff like farmed salmon now has to be injected with antibiotics, or chickens have to be injected with antibiotics because their immune systems don't grow fast enough to keep up with the size. A chicken in a battery grows so quickly that its own immune system can't keep up and it dies unless it's pumped full of antibiotics. We've been putting this in our food chain since the 1950s. Now, this was a real world experiment. There was no precedent and there was no testing over time on the impact of all of these chemicals that are now in our food chain and what they would have on the populace, other than what we are doing, which is watching to see what happens decades later, and we are. We have the most obvious is the obesity epidemic, which has massively affected the Western world through processed food, not affected the developed world to any degree at all. In fact, the only areas that have been affected are parts of Vietnam where it's considered cool to eat at McDonald's. Those are the only areas that actually have obesity problems. For the most part, it's the developed world that has these terrible obesity problems. Then you move into the world that is really scary. Sperm counts in the Western world have declined by 50% from 1973 to 2011. 50%. Why? What are the correlations that this has happened in the West and not happened in the developed world? The developed world still engages wholesale in natural farming. They grow animals and crops naturally, and they don't use chemicals in the food chain. This is my theory. I'm not saying that it's right. I'm saying I believe it. Look at food allergies. Food allergies overwhelmingly affect the developed world. America's food allergies have gone up 3 times since from 1993 to 2006. The number of people with food allergies tripled. In the UK, they went up 72% between 2013 and 2019. Why are so many kids? When I was at school, no one had food allergies. No one. You go to schools in a lot of the developing world, no one has food allergies. I believe that the chemicals introduced into our food chain are having these effects on us. We are killing ourselves with chemicals. We are an experiment. And I think that the spread of COVID amongst the most sanitized, best healthcare countries on earth is a result of the impact of chemicals on our immune systems. I don't have any evidence to say that that's true. I just look at COVID Live and look down, scroll through the list of countries, scroll through the countries that have had the most cases per capita, and the most deaths per capita. And you will see a stark realization of first world countries occupying the top half of the table and developing nations occupying the bottom half of the table. And there has to be a reason for this. It cannot just be that all of these nations didn't have an outbreak. Some of them have, but it's never took off like it did. And we have vaccines because that improves our immune system to fight the virus. So maybe these countries that haven't engaged wholesale in chemicals in their food chain have far better immune systems, just like they have far fewer food allergies, far better sperm counts, and far less obesity. We are killing ourselves with chemicals.